Good morning. This is Dr. Matt Springer here with our third segment of our food plot series. In this segment, we're going to cover maintaining the food plot once it's now been planted and established, and also looking at how do you measure success of your planting. Now, unfortunately, because our food plot just went in a couple weeks ago, we're going to have to go more to the traditional webinar scenario instead of having an actual video of doing these things. It's just timing didn't work out. We can't, if we were 4 or 5 months out from when we planted, we'd be able to do that and collect video and show you hands-on. Unfortunately, it's just not the way it has kind of set in place for us here. So we're going to use the traditional PowerPoint slides to kind of walk you through what you need to do. So a lot of what your actions are going to be after now that you have things planted is really more thinking about how do I act like a traditional farmer and control the weeds that are growing in my plot, and also how do you then figure out, is everything I did up to this point actually going to be successful in terms of attracting wildlife to the area. So let's cover the weeds part, and really they're going to be an issue, especially with new plots, because you just went in, eliminate all the competition, release that seed bed, put your own seeds in there, but you have what's in there already in that spot going to be as competition for what you planted. So you have to go through the process of checking on your plot fairly frequently as it's growing and maturing. And when you spot something that doesn't look right, identify what weed you have there and then choose that appropriate herbicide to eliminate it from your area. Now, an example of a common food plot weed here, this is smartweed. It's got pink flowers, and it's one that actually we want to promote if we're doing a waterfowl plot, but when we have it in an upland situation, especially during wet years, we want to get in there and remove it because it can really become quite dense and shade out everything in there that you've planted. So when we look at what herbicides you may want to become familiar with that are used commonly in food plots, we're going to start with the one that we use to actually clean the area out and kill all the competition. That's glyphosate. This can come in a couple different more commercial terms like Roundup, but this is basically a non-specific killer of plants. It's going to, anything it comes in contact with, it's going to have an impact on. Now we can get into some more specific ones that act on certain types of plants. So you want to be aware of those. And the next one there is for broadleaf plants, which you're going to have a wide assortment of broadleaf weeds that pop up in your plot. And the good thing here is you have a couple options. You have the generic straight and broad treatment that we use is 2,4-D. And this is, here's an example of one of the ways it's named for purchase in the picture. But you also have what's called 2,4-DB, which is a little bit more specific on how it acts, and it actually gives you a little bit of leeway in using it in your plot because it won't impact your clover, your alfalfa, and some of your legumes that you have planted. However, it will definitely impact any brassicas or chicory you have in the plot. So be aware of this as a potential tool. Then you also have, when you have grasses that pop up, you have 2 different options. The common ways you'll see them are either as post or vantage, or also rest max is the other company name that you'll see on the store. And what these really do is allows you to treat any grasses that pop in a broad spraying fashion, especially useful in places like clover plots as you see in the picture. Other things you may encounter outside of weeds, we have, wildlife pests can be something. You may have put a food plot in for one type of wildlife, but when you put food out in the landscape, there's going to be other animals that use it. So things like raccoons and groundhogs are concerned. Groundhog can easily wipe out entire 1/8 of an acre of soybeans if not taken care of on the front end, either through trapping or removal with a firearm. And sometimes even the animals that we're trying to attract can be a pest based on how quickly they browse down the plot that's present. And the scenario that usually comes up is soybeans. The first 6 weeks that they come out of the ground, they're highly attracted to deer. And if deer continuously browse them down and don't let them grow further and larger to past the point where they can take that browsing, you're going to basically have no food plot left by the time hunting season rolls around. So you may have to invest in a temporary electric fence to try to keep them out there 6 weeks or so. Finally, some other maintenance activities include things like mowing, which is a common practice for clover fields. It was believed that you should mow your clover field 2 or 3 times a year to promote new vegetative growth and increase that nutritional quality. Recent work by Craig Harper down in Tennessee has actually showed that that's not really a necessity. So you can either go in and mow it, it can't hurt it. Promote a thick stand. However, if it's a time-consuming or arduous task or one where you don't want to disturb the animals, you don't have to worry about getting in there and doing that. Now, how do you determine if this was successful or not? Well, you want to monitor those plots, and the easiest way to do that is through using exclosures, which let you know how much vegetation is actually growing in the plot without being eaten. And also, it lets you know how much is actually being eaten outside the plot. So you get this nice comparison. Then there's also using trail cameras, and where you really want to pair that with those exclosures to get an idea of how many animals are using the field, number of mouse consistently on that ground, and how much vegetation is then disappearing. So if you may have a lot of animals using the plot and the exclosure is not showing much of a difference, but your soil is so good that the vegetation is keeping up with that pressure. So it allows you to gauge what's really going on in terms of the amount of pressure versus your vegetation quality. Finally, when we come to the end of the year, and we try to reflect on what we've done and determine if what we have, all this effort that we put in, is a success or not, and do we need to change things in the next growing season, there's a couple things you need to keep in mind. First and foremost, if this is a new plot, then you really need to think not really judging success for the first 2 or 3 years, because it does take animals time to figure out that there's a food source there. A lot of our animals that use these areas are older, and therefore they know where food should be. So they're not necessarily always looking for new places to find food. Their nose can lead them in to places where they shouldn't be, like in this picture, or this animal ends up in the garage, but it doesn't necessarily mean they're going to find your new plot immediately upon being planted. So don't make any drastic changes to these new areas for at least 2 to 3 years till you give the animals enough time to actually know that's an area that there's going to be food consistently. Secondly, climate conditions that are naturally occurring in the landscape can drastically impact how much your animals in the area use your food plot. If it's a really good mass year and there's acorns everywhere, you could plant the best food plot you've ever planted in your life, and it will fail to that acorn food source every time. It's just, that's how good they are, and that's why we constantly talk about how important oaks are for wildlife. The other thing is, if it's a drought year or incredibly wet year, those aren't great times to judge whether or not your food plot is a success. Your stand may not have been as good. The quality of the stand may not have been as good. Maybe you just ended up with a dirt field. Don't make any drastic changes in years that occur. And finally, I want to recommend, if you want to continue doing food plots, I really recommend Dr. Craig Harper's University of Tennessee's book on wildlife food plots and early successional plants. It's basically the Bible for doing this kind of work in wildlife. He goes into great detail on strategies, also for individual species or groups of species, as well as the back, like 200 pages of this book are individual weeds, and it goes into, what is the name of the weed? How do you identify it? Does it have a wildlife value? If so, for what? And then how do you treat it and when you should treat it to get rid of it. It's an awesome resource. I tend to open this book up at least once a month. So it's well worth the price if you're going to be doing food plots year in, year out. And finally, I'm always here as a resource. Anyone that has questions or needs to bounce ideas, the best way to reach me is through my email, but I hope you don't have to reach out to me, because that means you're probably doing everything right. But I know that doesn't happen. So if you run into a problem, please don't hesitate to reach out to myself or anyone in our forestry extension team. Doesn't have to necessarily be a food plot question.